All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this celebratory program commemorating the 247th anniversary of Phi Beta Kappa's founding on December 5th, 1776. We are so pleased you could join us this evening to mark this special occasion. My name is Soleil Sanchez, and I'm Phi Beta Kappa's Associate Director of Chapters, Associations, and Member Engagement. Tonight, we will be focusing on the power of story from the perspective of the National Women's History Museum, a leading cultural institution that seeks to shine a spotlight on women's contributions and accomplishments that, for the most part, have been overlooked and omitted from the discussion of this country's history. We are so grateful to President and CEO Frédérique Irwin and Associate Educator for Digital Learning and Innovation, Emma Rothberg, for joining us this evening. And as we begin tonight's program, I want to acknowledge that the Phi Beta Kappa Society's early development took place at a time when slavery fundamentally shaped American colleges and the nation's revolutionary experiment. The Society will continue to examine our history and our responsibilities, leading by example as we aspire to meaningful, productive, and engaged lives. We know that for many of you, this may be your first virtual event with Phi Beta Kappa. We offer a special welcome to you. This program also represents a first-of-its-kind collaboration with one of Phi Beta Kappa's alumni associations to bring engaging content to members across the country. It is my pleasure now to introduce Pam Mallister, President of the Phi Beta Kappa Alumni Association of Greater Baltimore. The Baltimore Association is one of more than 40 associations nationwide that host virtual and in-person programs for Phi Beta Kappa members and serve as a resource and peer community for members in cities across the U.S. The Baltimore Association prides itself on hosting timely and insightful programs that offer perspectives on social issues. We are so grateful to the association for partnering with us tonight. A native of Washington, D.C., Pam is a Phi Beta Kappa member from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where she graduated with a BA in Spanish and International Studies. Pam spent the majority of her career as a high-level manager at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. Pam was awarded HHS's Distinguished Service Award and its Distinguished Volunteer Service Award. In addition to Pam's current role as board president of the Baltimore Association, she also serves on the board of the House of Ruth, Maryland, and the board of the Hampton Family Center, which she helped to found. Since our theme tonight is on the power of story, Pam will share a little bit about how this collaboration came about, as well as introduce tonight's moderator. Pam, thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Soleil. It's a joy to be with you all and to represent our Baltimore Alumni Association in this inaugural alumni virtual program. Baltimore has a very active alumni association and board, putting on a program every month, either in person or on Zoom. Highlights of programs include a holiday classical music program, a Zoom with a NASA scientist about life beyond our universe, an annual political event, this year by the head of the University of Virginia's Miller Center on presidential recordings. We've had programs on redlining in Baltimore and other important social issues, as you heard from Soleil. We also give a scholarship to a Baltimore City and a Baltimore County graduating high school senior every year. One of our board members, Barbara Holdridge, who started what has evolved into Books on Tape, has gotten us fabulous speakers, including tonight's keynote speaker. Barbara is relentless in pursuing the most interesting national speakers. In fact, Barbara recently approached PETA, and on April 16th, we will be having a new movie from PETA, followed by a question and answer period with the national president of PETA, Ingrid Kirk. So I want to thank Barbara for getting us our incredible keynote speaker tonight. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dolores Durán-Cerda, who will moderate our program this evening. Dolores currently serves as the Interim Chancellor of Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona, a Hispanic serving institution. The majority of PCC's students are first generation and are underrepresented. She is the first Latina to lead Pima in this capacity. Prior to this role, she served as Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, overseeing all academic areas of the college. Her primary emphasis is on furthering student success, fostering community engagement, and instilling a culture of caring at the college. Dolores is the recipient of several regional and national awards in teaching excellence and outstanding administration. She received a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on Literature of the Border and has presented at national and international conferences on pedagogy, literature, college-wide initiatives, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dolores earned her Ph.D. in Latin American literature with an emphasis in poetry, as well as her MA in Hispanic literature from the University of Arizona. She earned her BA in Spanish, French, and secondary education from the University of Iowa, where she was inducted also into Phi Beta Kappa. Today, she also serves as a Phi Beta Kappa senator and as president of the Tucson Phi Beta Kappa Alumni Association. She is the proud daughter of Mexican and Chilean immigrants. Dolores, it is a pleasure to pass the virtual microphone to you to serve as moderator for tonight's event. And thank you for your service to PBK.
Thank you, Pam. I'm so glad to share the stage with a fellow association president. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to come together, particularly on the anniversary of Phi Beta Kappa's founding. From its start, the society served as a conduit to learning, offering opportunities for individuals to come together and to discuss issues of consequence. Tonight's conversation, albeit 247 years later, continues that important tradition and allows us to improve upon it by learning from others who give voice to stories from key moments in our nation's history that may have otherwise gone unnoticed. There is a power in knowing one's story and an even greater power in sharing that story with others like we are tonight. I see this every day in my work at Pima College and in my own trajectory. As an example, in my family, and particularly my mom's side of the family from Mexico, there's a tradition of storytelling and of sharing proverbs and sayings. And these proverbs and sayings, growing up, I would hear them from my mother and my grandmother, taught me values and taught our family values. Just to name some examples, in Spanish, no hay mal que por bien no venga. The equivalent translation would be, every cloud has a silver lining. El que persevera alcanza. He or she who perseveres will reach his or her goals. And the last one I'll share is, querer es poder. To want is to be able to. And also there's storytelling through music. My grandfather was a humble farm worker, and he was born in 1900 in Arizona when Arizona was still a territory. He was musically talented and played several instruments, but his main instrument was a guitar. And he would sing corridos. I don't know if you're familiar with this genre, but it's a popular narrative song, a ballad, basically. And I wrote my senior honors thesis on corridos. But these are songs, the corridos are songs that are often perspectives, give perspectives and concerns about oppression, history of urban and rural working class people. And there's always a hero or a heroine that is described in the song. And what's interesting is that this genre of corridos comes from the 19th century as a Spanish romance, which is a poetic form, and was brought to Mexico by the conquistadores, the Spanish conquistadores. So that's one example. And in the classroom, when I was a faculty member, I taught Spanish for heritage learners or native speakers. And I had my students do a research project on the oral tradition in their own families, where they had to interview a family member, or if not, a neighbor or a friend. And I remember one particular student who interviewed his grandmother. And he thanked me for giving him this assignment. He said, I never would have known that my grandmother was a nurse during the Mexican Revolution to the soldiers. She never talked about it. And until I interviewed her, I found out. And I'm so honored that she's part of our family, is what my student said. So these histories, these stories, the power of them is so relevant to all of us. We can say that the power of story in the arts and the sciences is critical. In addition, it's important to note how important it is to partner with and putting the spotlight on key cultural institutions such as the National Women's History Museum, which helps us all in engaging in lifelong learning. So for these reasons, I'm so pleased and honored to be asked to serve as tonight's moderator, as the work of the National Women's History Museum is key to a fuller understanding of so many aspects of our nation's history. With us tonight from the museum, our president and CEO, Frédérique, or Fred Irwin, and associate educator, Emma Rothberg. Fred comes to her role as president with more than 35 years of experience in strategic management, nonprofit and commercial business, operations, impact, and entrepreneurship. She has served as managing director of impact strategy at the Sorensen Impact Center, where she managed high-level partnerships with leading organizations in the social impact sector. During that time, she also led initiatives focused on improving equity in higher education and driving change for women entrepreneurs. And prior to our event tonight, we had a conversation about her work. Fred also founded Her Corner, a company educating women on how to scale their businesses, and was a frequent speaker at the State of Entrepreneurship for Women in the US. Her work supporting women earned her a spot as a New Zealand Edmund Hillary Fellow, a global fellowship for impact leaders. She has taught business management, entrepreneurship, and organizational behavior at the Kogod School of Business at American University. Fred holds a master's in business administration from the Graduate School of Business at the College of William and Mary, and a Bachelor of Arts in Russian Studies from Davidson College. She is a dual citizen of the United States and European Union. Welcome, Fred. Next, I'd like to introduce Emma. Emma currently serves as the museum's Associate Educator of Digital Learning and Innovation. In this role, she works to ensure rich and diversified online educational experiences for virtual audiences, providing leadership and oversight to digital learning strategies and digital asset management. She oversees the development, implementation, and evaluation of online educational programming. Emma earned a BA in history and Phi Beta Kappa membership from Wesleyan University, and an MA and Ph.D. in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her graduate research focused on gender, cultural, and urban history in the United States. Emma's professional interests include the role of digital humanities in expanding public awareness and knowledge of history. Fred and Emma, it is truly an honor to be here in this conversation with you this evening. And for our audience members, I will get things going with a series of questions, and we will save time for your questions toward the end of the program. Please enter your questions into the Zoom chat, and we will take as many as we can where there's time allowed. So with that, let's get started. Are we ready? Yes? Okay.
Let's do this.
Let's do it. So Fred, we'll start with you. Please tell us a little bit about your story, one that took a Russian studies major from Davidson College through several entrepreneurial roles. How did your story shape you and prepare you for where you are today?
Thank you, Dolores. And before I answer your question, I just want to say thank you. It is such an honor to be here tonight. I love the fact that tonight is the 247th anniversary of the founding of Phi Beta Kappa. It is really a remarkable organization and such an honor and privilege to be here tonight. Thank you. And Dolores, I really enjoyed your story a little bit as you were sharing about your own personal story. And one of the things that I have learned from my fellowship in New Zealand, which is really steeped in the Maori culture, is that we are a who before we're a what. And that is really something that they lean into in New Zealand. And I really, I love that kind of concept. I also am a first-generation American. Both my parents were French immigrants to the United States, and I grew up during a time when the Cold War was ending. And because I grew up speaking several languages, I had actually already placed out of all the language options by the time I was 15. And so I asked my parents what language I should learn next, and they suggested Russian because the Cold War was ending. The only place at the time in Washington, D.C. To learn, this was about 1985, I guess, something like that, to learn Russian. I'm not sure about that date. I'll have to come back. Anyways, the only place to do that was at Georgetown University. Georgetown was the only place starting to offer Russian language. So at 15, it was me and the correspondents on Saturdays for 3-hour classes, and I started learning Russian. And I had learned a while back that the only way to truly learn a language is to immerse yourself in the country. And so I spent a year in both Ukraine and St. Petersburg, really learning about the culture and the literature and a lot of the things, frankly, that we as Americans didn't know during the Cold War. And so I really much enjoyed that. But at the core of all of that, frankly, was my desire to get to know more people. The reason I loved languages was because it allowed me to speak to even more people, to hear their stories, to understand their culture and their background. And that's a theme that has existed for me through my entire life. I went on to build several companies, and the theme around that was also always around women's empowerment. And how could many of us who were, professionally raised as a time when we were told, oh, you can do anything, you can be anything, it was still quite a struggle. And so I was trying through all of that time, whether it was through the companies I was building or professionally, always to create female alliances, to encourage women to support one another and tell one another their stories in order to remind them that they could, in fact, achieve whatever they want, even though it was, of course, not going to be easy. And so, frankly, when the National Women's History Museum came up as an opportunity about a year ago, at first I wasn't really sure because I don't come from the museum world. Unlike Emma, I'm not a historian, and I really wasn't exactly sure that, why my background would be a good fit. But the more I spoke to the board and the leadership, the more I realized how critically important now, today, it is to really focus on storytelling, women's history, making sure that future generations understand what the women before us have done and what they're capable of doing, and that we need everybody at the table and activated to help us solve all of the problems that we face as a globe, but particular here in the United States. So that's kind of what brought me to the museum, is the desire to really lean into that. And here I am.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing your own story. And this tonight might be the first time that our members are learning about the efforts behind the National Women's History Museum. Fred, could you please share a little bit about the museum's history, its mission, and future direction?
Absolutely. So the museum has actually been around for nearly 30 years, 27 years to be exact. And it was founded by a woman, Karen Stasser, who realized that there were very few women either in statues, monuments, in books, etc. And she began kind of through an initiative to bring these suffragists who were on a statue back out of the crypt of the Capitol back up. It took years, and that was really kind of the ability to do that and to realize that we needed more women's history in our classrooms that led to the founding of the museum. The museum then spent many years and its own money lobbying to try to get a physical brick and mortar building for women's history. And it was a long, long process. And finally, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago now, it was finally commissioned that there would be an American Women's History Museum as part of the Smithsonian, which was for us a massive win, because the Smithsonian, guarantees that it'll be here for in perpetuity, that there's federal funding behind it. And it was really kind of our objective. And at the same time, once that was achieved, we realized it's a long process. So while there will eventually be an American Women's History Museum, it could be another decade, the National Women's History Museum continues to do its work by, in my mind, really focusing on the National Women's History Museum, meaning there will be this centralized, physical, object-based place in the future in Washington. And our job today is more of a decentralized national strategy. So making sure that we're bringing women's history to our educators, to the classrooms, as well as to that generation of learners and people, men and women, and young girls and boys who need to learn some of these stories as they move into their life and their decision-making opportunities in the future. And so that's kind of where we are today. We have always been, and we remain, a virtual first organization, which actually, given the rise in artificial intelligence, is very lucky, because everything we've ever done is already in the digital realm. And so we're not, dramatically trying and get everything online. It's already there, which means that as, artificial intelligence is out there and scraping the internet and doing its thing, we already have so much women's history out there already. So.
Thank you for sharing that. And I was reviewing the website and all the different wonderful resources there are for educators. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be sharing that with my own faculty too.
Wonderful.
So my next question, yes. So my next question is for both of you, for Fred and for Emma. One of the lines from the museum's website caught our attention, and it says, "Inclusive history is good history." Could you describe what that philosophy frames, how that philosophy frames the work of the museum and its staff?
Emma, why don't you kick it off?
So the world is made up of many different people from many different backgrounds, and that is true historically as well. So you can't understand history without actually looking at the stories of many different people and one story from many different perspectives. You have to be inclusive of different voices. You have to be inclusive of different perspectives and experiences. So even the stories that kind of, historically, that history has been written about dead white men, you can't even understand those dead white men within their contexts if you're not looking at a larger, more inclusive history that thinks about who those men that are centered and have been historically centered in the narrative were reacting to. So just from a kind of historical perspective, and as a historian, I am always striving to make sure that I'm looking at an event, a movement, a person's life from multiple perspectives to not only better understand the context in which they lived, but to better understand them. So that's what I would say is the reason why inclusive history is good history. It's better contextualized and deeper history when you look at it from multiple perspectives.
Thank you.
And I love that answer, because it's so different from the way I see the world and so complementary to kind of the way I see our role in the museum. I think not only about what Emma said about the inclusiveness of the story, but I think about the impact of that. And so if women have been underrepresented in our classrooms, and we know that they have because we surveyed actually back in 2017, we looked at what percentage of women were represented in the standards of learning. Less than, or it was actually 15% of what is taught is about women's accomplishments, half of which is in a domestic capacity. So for example, Martha was married to George. And so, you know, the problem that I find with that is that that underrepresentation, not only in classrooms, but in, you know, a number of different visual monuments and statues, it then shows up in our country in the future. And it distorts the worldview of our future generations, meaning today, we still have less than 30% representation in the US Senate, in the House of Representatives, in representation in US STEM workforces, or women on Fortune 500 boards. So there's a real impact to not having inclusive history in the classroom that encourages those young girls and boys to see the potential and future for their colleagues in the future.
And if I could
Absolutely.
add one more, oh, sorry, if I
Please
could add
do.
one more thing to that. You know, this kind of question of representation and monuments has come up. And one of the anecdotes that I use to illustrate this, I'm based in New York City. And a couple of years ago, they did a study about the number of women that were in statues across the city, so monuments, particularly in Central Park. There were none. The only reason that women were represented in monuments throughout the city was as allegorical figures or as figures from fiction, as nymphs, stuff like that. And as someone who grew up in New York City, I never noticed that absence. It never struck me as odd. And then, of course, I hear this study and thinking, how can you not represent 50% of the population in a monument, which even by its name, monumentalizing, right? We are adding, we see it as this as object of importance, and women were not included in that story. So New York City is rectifying that, which I'm very happy about. But just to go back to Fred's point about the ways in which it influences the next generation, right? Like the history and an inclusive history, a history that involves everyone's stories, shouldn't be an afterthought.
Exactly. And from generation to generation, I mean, this is the legacy that we're leaving, right? Thank you both. My next question is for Emma. It is easy to reduce the study of history to a simple recollection of facts and dates. How does storytelling make learning an inclusive history more accessible and relatable?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. My love of history began with a love of stories. My parents gave me children's books that were, I think the first one that I really became obsessed with was a children's book written about the Titanic. And the history is a lived experience, right? We live through history, and our lived experiences create history. It's not just a date that appears on a calendar. So a date is a point in the story, and we need to understand history. We need to understand cause and effect. We need to understand the larger context. And that is a story, right? You know, how did we get from point A to point B? And Dolores, I really loved how you shared your own story in the beginning, and also the story of one of your students who learned more by having a conversation with their grandparent. And again, I think it's just so important to remind people that history is about human beings, right? It is humanizing to tell history as a story, as opposed to a bunch of dates and names that are devoid of context, that don't have any relationship to each other. I mean, first of all, I find it a little boring to tell history like that, but that's also just not how history is created, right? It is created by people making conscious or sometimes unconscious decisions, but living their day to day. And when you tell history as a story, not only do I think it's better history, but I think it's more engaging to learners because they can empathize with the subjects. They can see themselves as human beings who were making choices, who sometimes made mistakes. And that is far more relatable than memorize this date, put it on a timeline, and therefore somehow you understand the American Revolution if you know that the Boston Tea Party happened before Bunker Hill. if you don't know stories about that, those names are not going to be as meaningful to you as if you can focus in on the story of maybe one soldier who served or one person who saw the tea go into the harbor.
It makes it much more memorable and, like you say, accessible and relatable to perhaps their own families. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
So my next question, Emma, is for you, and it's more on the techie side. So the museum creates and curates and draws from a vast network of digital resources. Can you share a little bit about the virtual exhibits that have drawn most visitors? And what is one that you believe should be receiving more attention?
Yeah, so Fred and I actually, we talked about this question a little bit before we came online, and the thing about the most visited exhibit is that really that relates to time being on the website as opposed to the exhibit that is the most important. So I'm going to answer the question by kind of not answering that part, but say that one of the exhibits that we're incredibly proud of and we love to see more people check out, hopefully everyone on this call, is We Who Believe in Freedom, Black Feminist DC. So it is the online companion to our in-person exhibit at the Martin Luther King Jr. Library in Washington, DC, that focuses on the stories of Black women who, through their unending efforts, tried to make things more accessible for everyone. So part of the reason why we really love this exhibit is not only does it use a new digital platform for us, it uses ArcGIS, and that is representative of the new way that we're going to build virtual exhibits online. But again, it is a representation of that inclusive history and that storytelling that we have all been focused on tonight. So that's why I love that exhibit and why I'd love to see more people check it out, because you're going to learn stories about women and their accomplishments that aren't as widely known as we think that they should be. We think these women are so important. They've made such an impact and their names should be top of mind. But they're also local stories that have had national significance and have national relationships, which is also matching up with, as Fred said, focusing on the National Women's History Museum. So yeah, We Who Believe in Freedom, Black Feminist DC, you can find it on our website. And if you happen to be in DC, we encourage you to check out the in-person exhibition as well.
I plan to do both. Thank you so much, Emma. My next question is for Fred. Your current in-person exhibit is a collaboration with the Martin Luther King Jr. Library in Washington and shines a light on Black feminism in DC. Could you tell us how that partnership came about and what you hope the exhibit will accomplish? And we kind of touched a bit upon it, but if you could elaborate, please.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that is complementary to what we've been talking about here tonight is not just about making history more inclusive, but also making it highly accessible. And so, one of the things that we were testing out with this small exhibit in partnership with the MLK Library was twofold. One, what happens when you put a small exhibit in a city that is about the women in those cities, and who not only made an impact in that city, but on a national level as well? And what happens when you choose a place for that exhibit that's highly accessible to people walking in the door all the time? And that was really at the heart of that first in-person exhibit. Like I said, we are not trying, now that there will be a future museum, we're not trying to build a big building. What we want to do now is say, what are the cultural institutions across the country that are highly accessible, like the MLK Library, where we could come and bring exhibits about the women across the country? Because it is a little bit inequitable to hope that in the future a young woman or girl will fly to Washington, D.C. and have the privilege to fly to Washington, D.C., that she may walk into a building, that she may walk into this future Women's History Museum, and that at that point she may be compelled to act, to learn, to spark courage that we seek to see in them. And so we chose that that project because of its accessibility for that partnership, but also that topic, as Emma said, because these women are so incredibly important. And what is absolutely mind-blowing is that so many of us, in fact, the vast majority of us, do not know the stories of these women. And these women made such a significant impact on so many different parts of our lives that we all benefit from. It's not just something that they did for their fellow African American women. It's really Black feminism and how it lifts so many others up. And so that's a little bit about how that partnership came to be and what we hope the exhibit accomplishes, which is if you can't get there in person, as Emma said, you can visit it online, and we want as much amplification of these stories as we can get.
Thank you. And maybe just to add on to this topic about access, how do we make it particularly accessible to women to higher education as a whole? And how do you see this role of the museum elevating the importance of this issue to our audience? And both of you can chime in.
Well, I'll give my perspective, and then Emma, I know you'll have a complimentary one. The things that I think about when I think about higher ed are things like not women going to college. We know that women have outpaced men in terms of attending university for the last several decades. But the careers and the opportunities that they pursue, because what I want to see is through the stories that we tell, the histories that we tell, the stories of many of the women like Barbara Holtworth today, who was the one that brought us together. These stories need to be at the forefront of these girls and these women's minds when they go into higher ed, so that they can think like, hey, this woman built, basically audiobooks before audiobooks existed. If she can do it, I can get into technology too. And so that's part of the reason why it's so critically important, is to be able to encourage people to believe that they can, and to see their own light and their ability to really kind of shine. Emma, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I would answer it from a bit of a historical perspective as well. And it's in part informed, my answer is in part informed by the fact that the National Women's History Museum will be premiering a new digital exhibition on Title IX at the end of this month. So I think the other reason why it's so important is that, as Fred said, women are the majority on college campuses in the United States at this point. But that was not always true. Even in recent history, that was not true. And it was because of legislation like Title IX and associated acts that came after it that opened up that access to higher education. And it's because of women like Representative Patsy Mink, Representative Edith Green, and Bernie Sandler, who worked tirelessly for decades to make sure that that legislation was passed, and not only passed, but actually had teeth. Right. So I think that the part of the reason why it's so important to know the history specifically of Title IX is so that when we are filling out those college applications, we remember that there were people who worked so hard to give that access. And that access is not evenly distributed. Just because the door is open doesn't mean everyone has equal opportunity to access that open door. And that there still needs to be a lot of work done on preparing women in K through 12 education to be able to access a college education if that's something that they want to pursue. So yeah, that's kind of how I would answer the question too, is that always remember the kind of the history behind the issues that we're talking about today. They don't just happen in a vacuum. They didn't just appear. There's this very long kind of longue durée of how we got to this point, and it's so important to know the names and the stories of the people who helped get us to this moment.
Right. And I'm reminded of how we in our institutions talk about the importance of having faculty that look like the students to be role models. And so the students can see themselves in the front of the classroom if they think of going into the profession too. So thank you for that. Excellent. So I have one final question before we open up the questions to the audience from the chat. What do you hope will be the museum's legacy if you are successful in your efforts? Fred?
You know, we often say that our legacy is not the objects we display, but the courage we will spark and the action we will encourage. And I say that because I want to see the long-term effect of having these stories told and these women's accomplishments shared. And what's interesting is that when I first came to Sorensen, or when I first came from Sorensen to the museum, I was asked to put together a strategy. And I put together, because that's my background, I put together a 5-year strategy, which we're just finalizing now for the museum. This very national effort to get women's stories out across the country, both through in-person exhibits and digital. And the truth is that I genuinely believe in the impact that we can have. And at the same time, this is my first time running a nonprofit. And I've worked in nonprofits, but I've not always run them before. And what I will say is that if there are women and men on the call tonight who feel compelled by what we are talking about, who believe in the importance of what our mission is, then I would ask for support. And because we cannot do it alone, and we'd love the help for anybody who wants to get involved and who wants to be behind our mission.
Thank you for that. So Fred and Emma, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your time this evening with all of us. I know I'll be thinking of the stories and the insights you've shared tonight, and I know that others on the call will be as well, I'm sure. So we encourage all of our members to explore the museum's virtual exhibits and follow the museum's progress as they move forward from here. The work you do is so important, and there is so much more work to do, but it's so insightful and so inspiring, everything that you do. Soleil, I believe you have been gathering questions from the chat. Do you mind posting a few of those for Fred and Emma?
Yeah, so I will go ahead and start. If Fred and Emma, could you talk a bit about how the work of the museum lends itself to the vibrancy of the arts and sciences?
Emma, do you want me to take a pass at that, or do you?
I think that's a very big question. So I think I need a second. So Fred, if you've got an answer.
Okay, well, I have two answers. I'll share mine, but I think Emma, from your perspective, it would be interesting to hear about all the biographies and the work that's been done in the arts and sciences. But what I will say from the other perspective is that over the last several months, we've held over 20 events across the country. And one of the most beautiful intersections I've seen has been when we bring together artists who are feminist artists, who bring kind of their work, whether it's through poetry, whether it's through photography, whether it's through momentum and marches, to the work that we're doing. Because there is so much momentum when you bring women together, and you bring that creative force together with kind of the historical and educator force. All of a sudden, you really begin to feel the power of what women can do. So I actually love the intersection of arts and sciences with what we're doing, and we're actually hoping to do more of it going forward. Emma, how about you?
Yeah, I think what I would say is that, the arts and sciences, if we think of, kind of colleges of arts and sciences, that includes history, right? History education, I think, is so important, not only so we better understand kind of where we are in terms of, the state of this country, where we are as people who live here, as citizens of this nation. And I don't mean citizens in the legal sense, but, in the sense of that, we are civic beings of this civic body. Sorry, my apologies. And I think that constantly promoting history education as integral to our understanding as ourselves as Americans, and a better way, hopefully, of us interacting with those institutions and making choices. I think history education is so important to that. And with the National Women's History Museum, with all of the digital resources that we've created, including over 250 biographies on individual women, including over 30 online exhibitions, and many, many, many virtual programs that have been recorded and put on our YouTube page, that include panelists, historians, practitioners, activists, who are all talking about what gets them out of bed every day and what they do to make an impact. I think just from an education perspective, history is so important, particularly sharing the stories of those who were sidelined or erased in the archive and in the narrative as we've historically told it. So hopefully, yeah, that's my answer.
Great, thank you. I think your last statement kind of goes into maybe this next question that someone had about how the intersection of gender diversity, for example, trans people or people who identify as non-binary, impacts the current movement of diverse history inclusion of women's stories.
I mean, I will say, so if we tell the stories of people who identify as women, we have done that. We have biographies of women on our website who are very proud and open trans women, but they identify as women. And I think there's also something to be said about that the skills for learning and studying women's history are applicable to learning and studying and understanding the stories of many other groups of people who have been left out of the narrative, who have been erased from the narrative. The ways in which you can learn to read the silences and understand and take impact from those silences is applicable for understanding history and gender diversity in that history. But Fred, I don't know if you have a different answer.
No.
I
don't have anything to add. I think you said it beautifully in terms of how we think about it. So thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we have a couple of different questions that address the differences between a digital museum versus a brick and mortar museum, and the different ways you'll be managing that. So I'm just going to try to combine them a bit. One of the questions touches on why do a brick and mortar in the first place? Why not kind of stick to the digital in the 21st century? And then when thinking about the differences between the in-person and virtual museum, what are the different ways that you all will measure success? And are there other major differences that you are planning for?
Well, I will tackle this one because I get this question a lot. So first, I think it's important for me to remind people that the two will be completely separate organizations. So while our museum is the one that put in the time, the effort, the money to really say, like, we must have a brick and mortar museum, when it was congressionally approved, it was decided that it would live within the Smithsonian world, if you will. Now, they did say to us that they wanted 2 of our board members to sit on the planning committee, the oversight committee for that, because we have been in this space now for nearly 30 years. So there is a lot of intersection between the 2 organizations, but we are 2 completely different organizations. They will be a federally funded Smithsonian Museum. We remain a 501c3. Now, people often ask me, why not merge? Why, when it opens, will you guys integrate to them in them? And I often say, I don't know, but I'm not going to sit around for 10 years and hope for the best, right? So over the next 10 years, while they are doing what they do to build a big brick and mortar museum, meaning building finding the objects, building the collections, finding the location, building the museum, right? We are going to continue amplifying women's history across the country. If there is, to the question about the 21st century, if we get 10 years down the road and museums look like or have gone the same path as newspapers, for example, which is possible, frankly, post-COVID, it's made us all wonder about these place-based spaces, then of course there can always be a conversation about integration. But my measure of success is about the impact we can have on representation and inclusivity. Their measures of success will be very different. But together we are trying to move women's empowerment forward. And I like to remind people that there are 2 museums in this country for mustard. I'm pretty sure we can handle 2 museums for women's history and accomplishments.
Great, thank you. Do either of you have a word of advice to young women entering the museum field?
How about you, Emma?
Yeah, I would say that if you are passionate about learning, and I would say both as a practitioner and also if you self-identify as a lifelong learner, then museums are a wonderful place to be and work. One of the things that I enjoy is that as I am writing biographies or I'm writing exhibitions, I'm managing virtual programs, I am constantly learning something new. And I then get to share those stories and incorporate them into other stories that I get to share. So the advice that I would give is find something that you're passionate about. It could be mustard, it could be women's history, and there will be an organization out there that would love to have your passion and your skills and your enthusiasm for just remaining curious. So that's what I would say. I didn't come to the museum world from the kind of museum education background. I came from it from a Ph.D. In academia. So my career path may not look like everybody else's, but what drew me to museums was my passion for learning and then sharing what I'd learned about women's history.
All right, I'm gonna wrap up the questions, but before I do that, I wanted to just note that there are plenty of people in the chat and the Q&A that are really interested in learning more about your organization and participating in any way possible. Do you have any advice on where they could go to do that?
womenshistory.org is our website. We can drop it in the chat. I'm also more than happy to include my email. It's Irwin at Women's History. Is that it, Emma? Now I'm blanking, but I think that's my email.
I'll pull it and drop it in the chat.
But I love every week. One of my favorite things to do is to have conversations with longtime donors, women and men who are passionate about the work that we do and why it matters and the impact that we think it can have. So I always encourage people, just drop me an email if you want to be involved, if you want to hear about our strategic vision and plan for the next 5 years. That's how this happened, because I sent Barbara a note saying, hey, thank you for being a longtime supporter and donor. And she picked up the phone and she called me. And we had a lovely conversation. And she said, yo, I'm part of this group. So yeah, womenshistory.org. And then I'm always happy to talk to anyone who wants to have a conversation about what we're doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you, Frédérique and Emma, for being with us tonight. And thank you, Dolores, as well. I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you to wrap up the program.
Thank you, Soleil. As you were having this conversation, I was thinking back to my PhD dissertation, which I wrote in Spanish, and it was La voz del silencio femenino en la poesía de Marjorie Agosin. So the voice of female silence in the poetry of Marjorie Agosin, who's a Chilean Jewish author. And my analysis was looking at the different silences. And Emma, you talked about that. So imposed and self-imposed silences that reflect on stereotypes, taboos, and censorship. So just wanted to add that as what's been important to me as well. But as we draw this program to a close, I again want to thank Fred and Emma for their insights and ask them to pass on our thanks to all of the staff and the donors who make their work possible. We will share the link to the museum's website, and I think we just did, and follow up with an email so you can further explore all the wonderful content and learn more about the impact and future plans of the museum. Thanks also to my fellow association president, Pam. She and I both urge you to find your local Phi Beta Kappa association and stay connected with us. Coming together in the spirit of learning, of lifelong learning, is truly a joy, and we hope to share that experience with more Phi Beta Kappa members, especially as we look ahead to our celebrations, including our milestone 250th anniversary in 2026. So if you do not have an association near you, we hope to offer additional virtual programs next year. You can also visit the Phi Beta Kappa website and see if there are any events near you, such as the visiting scholar lectures that may be close by. And don't forget to visit our social media as well, such as LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. It's a great way to stay connected. So we're so grateful for everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. And the Phi Beta Kappa staff will post the video to their YouTube channel. Wish everyone a wonderful and safe, peaceful holiday season. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for having us. And thank you to everybody who came in to listen.
Yes, thank you so much.